Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And if you are watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. I am back today with my colleague Andy over here at That's Comical. Andy, I hope that you are doing all right this evening.
Doing great and doing even better now that we're having this chat.
Yeah, so this was actually supposed to be a three-person chat, but unfortunately our other colleague had to back out. And for me, it was sort of a shame that this happened because this was actually their idea. And the fact that whenever this happens, we're always told the show goes on, so we figured we might as well. And I don't feel that we're going to disappoint because tonight's a very, very special night. It's an episode of Creators Notes, a show over here on this channel that we don't do frequently, but when we do, we always end up having such a satisfying and fulfilling discussion, just talking about a singular entity that gave birth to some of the greatest things that comic books have to offer. And we're pretty much going to be talking about the God Almighty of everything that is the current state of comic books. I mean, whenever you talk about the greatest creators in comic books, the greatest among greats is always the legendary Jack Kirby. And we thought that it would be appropriate to do one of these around now for him because yesterday was actually his birthday, August 28th, and also very proud to be his birthday buddy.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think you're exactly right, Steve. Jack Kirby is one of the absolute greats, a contender for the Mount Rushmore of comics. Um, just the things that he contributed both in terms of the actual properties and work, and in terms of what his work meant for comics and how it's looked back on and referred, and what it did to change the entire trajectory of comics is nearly unparalleled at the very least.
Yeah.
So in terms of a creator's notes episode, it's there's very few people who are as important to talk about that we could get to. So this will probably be a little bit of a different creator's notes than when we talk about, like a modern writer, modern artist, someone who's actively putting out stuff, even someone who has their largest mark a few years back, and it might not actively be in the comic scene anymore. This will be a little different, a little bit of a if not a formal history or anything, something
Absolutely.
that'll be talking about legacy. I think that's really the word that's going to be important for this one.
And if you are a Jack Kirby fan and absolutely know him backwards and forwards, or if you're someone that only knows the name and what he contributed to comics and want to do a little bit more of a personal dig, then I would like to recommend a very special book. This is called Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics by Tom Scioli or Scioli. I don't know how to pronounce this gentleman's last name, but this is a biography of Jack Kirby written in comic strip format, which I think is really, really creative. There was also a follow up by the same writer a couple years later called I Am Stan, which is actually the same kind of thing, but for Stan Lee. And Stan Lee is going to be in this conversation for better or for worse, just to put it lightly. But I will personally say, knowing who Jack Kirby is and what he brought to the world of comics, when I read this book and I learned a great deal about him, there was a lot of things that I didn't know. And it really, I hate to use this cliche because, oh man, this is like going to remind me of my booktube days. It really got me in the feels because we're going to go a little bit deeper in this, but I still cannot get over all the wonderful things that Jack Kirby did and yet how poorly he was treated as a creator. And that's really what hurts when it comes to knowing what he contributed and what comics are today, and yet the way that he left the industry and eventually left this plane of existence, still very appreciative of what the gods gave him and still never regretted a single thing that he did, but still, he did leave this world a bit bitter. And that, I think, is one of the things you don't need to hear, but something? You can't sugarcoat the truth. The truth does hurt. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight.
Yeah, we'll get to that, of course. I'd say in shorthand, uh, not to hyperbolize it, but as in like comparative point, to a certain extent, he's comics Vincent van Gogh. I do think that comic creators have valued Jack Kirby for a very long time. I do think that deep comic fans are aware of how important he is to the history of comics. But I think that there was a kind of valley and appreciation that has really taken it has launched like a rocket in recent years as Marvel in particular has become more comfortable kind of talking about the legacy of Jack Kirby posthumously. So, there's obviously some bitterness that he carried in his own life. But to the fans like us and anybody watching this who's here to enjoy it today, we do just get to enjoy his impact on comics, and that's a beautiful thing. And an overarching point to this whole episode, I would say, is, let's we're experiencing the joy of what Jack Kirby brought.
Yes,
And there's no need to sugarcoat that because that's amazing, the impact that he had, and I think we can all be thrilled about that.
absolutely. So we begin at the beginning with this gentleman. He was born into this world on August 28th, 1917, raised in a tenement in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, born Jacob Kurtzberg to a observant Jewish family, like, dare I say it, a lot of the comic creators of then were. And they discovered his talent at a very early age. One of the stories that I learned that I thought was quite entertaining was the fact that when he was a young boy, you know, he did the typical things that boys did, but one of the few things that he did have was a vast and constant in motion imagination. One of the stories that I learned was that in the tenement where he grew up, there was this dark corridor in one of the floors. And there was this one day when he was like 5 or 6, and he took some charcoal and he created this drawing of a vast cosmic universe all over. And then the landlord brings him up to his mother and says, "Your son just vandalized my tenement." And when his mother came down to see what he did, she didn't have a reaction like, "Oh, Jacob, I can't believe you did this." It was a, "Oh, Jacob, I can't believe you did this." And that and the rest is history.
Yeah, I love that story. I also love that story thinking about had it not been painted over, how much that would have been worth
Oh yeah,
someday as
exactly.
a tourist attraction.
Exactly. It's such a crazy thing how you talk about the greats. It's like, you wonder, when did Babe Ruth first discover that he had the talents to be a baseball player? When was it that Walt Disney first picked up a pencil and started sketching? Or when did Charles Schultz decide that he wanted to make a simple comic strip about an unlucky boy and a completely imaginative dog? It's like you wonder, like, where did these beginnings start? And this is definitely one of the more appropriate ways for a young boy who would eventually go into comic book art would start, because comic books really were not a thing then. They were not even in existence. I mean, you had your basic comic strips in the newspapers and in a couple of up and coming early magazines of the early 1900s. And that was basically all you had in terms of what was classified as a comic. So one of the few things that he did notice was the fact that comics were something different, something original and fresh. They weren't like going into a museum and seeing a masterpiece from a classic Renaissance painter. It wasn't the same as things that you would find like illustrations in a picture book. This is something totally new and exaggerated to a degree. Some of them can be very much slice of life, but there are elements in comic book art that are very outlandish, and that is really the originality that attracts a reader to
Mm-hmm.
a world that is comic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's a through line from the little story that we've heard about his childhood, right? That the images were some sort of galactic thing in nature, that it's grander, that I mean, you see the through line in the stories that he would participate in bringing to life were bigger than real, right? And truly found a way to pioneer in comics this entire idea of what we think of as the superhero genre being something on its own that's distinct from a plain detective story, a plain hero story, something really special and really different. And I think that story is also really wonderful for people to look back on who are creatives because it's such a relatable thing in that comics, you're right, looked down upon, weren't much, strips in the newspaper, maybe at times, right? There's kind of this classic image of the bad kid drawing in class instead of paying attention, the kid who's doing art instead of doing what they should be doing art in ways that is not accepted by people around them, that I think is deeply relatable to creative people because that's a if not universal experience, it's a really effing common experience, right? Um, and so I think that's a beautiful thing about those beginnings because the way that kids now grow up doodling superheroes in the margins of their notebook, you know, Jack Kirby had the experience of doing that without there being a Jack Kirby first, right?
Exactly.
Which I think is a really, really special thing to think about and focus on in the way his legacy continues.
And so, of course, as he goes into his teen years and into his college years as a young adult, entertainment already starts to go through massive changes in such a short period of time. Everything from the first talkie movies to the first animations from like Steamboat Willie from Walt Disney, as well as just basic cartoons like early Looney Tunes and stuff like that. And Jack Kirby basically grows with this because there were a few things that I had not known about. Like I had no idea that he went to the Pratt Institute and immediately left because he just didn't feel that this is what he wanted to do. They really didn't focus on the kind of art that he wanted to focus on. And I never would have known in a million years that his very first job was at the Max Fleischer Studios. I mean, you think of
Hmm.
Fleischer, you think of the early Superman cartoons. You even think of Looney Tunes in general because he was one of those great Looney Tunes artists alongside guys like Tex Avery and Fritz Frilling and Chuck Jones. So he really did start off in a great place, but he just wasn't getting what he wanted in regards to stretch his creativity because one of the few things that constantly talks about Jack Kirby and why he is so great is the fact that his mind is always working and his hand is always moving. You had to make sure that there was always something that he could write with in his hand because if you didn't put a pencil or a pen in his hand at that exact moment, you were going to miss out on something truly special. The fact that we'll get into this later, but even as he gets towards the end of his career, it's like he ended up stopping to do like the basic essentials of life because all he was doing was just thinking about creating and drawing. And it was just like, thank God he had the support system that he did, but we'll get into that a little bit later as well. But yeah, so he actually was one of the people that helped edit some of the first Popeye cartoons, which I thought was very interesting to me as well. But again, something that he just didn't want to do. And then in the end, he started going to some of the smaller comic book companies because, of course, now we're going into the 30s and we've
Mhm.
already officially seen the beginnings of the superheroes like Superman and Batman over at DC Comics. And there's another little company called Timely Comics that comes out at that time. And that is around the time when he meets the man who he needed to meet when he did, and that was Joe Simon.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if we want to getting into the relationship with Joe Simon, but there is one thing I wanted to mention. Just as he started kind of entering his career, as it would become in comics and in art. Uh, Obviously he did change his name, which
Yes.
at the current times feels, it almost feels quaint. It feels funny to think about that, kind of ditching a more Jewish name to fit into Check's Notes, the comics industry. Obviously, a lot of fantastic figures in comics have been Jewish, and at this time in particular were, and some of the originators of the comic scene as we know it. Um, I find it interesting that he did need to, or felt the need to drop that at the time, in
Well,
order to make a
it
career
was,
out of it.
but that was also something that everyone in Hollywood was
I
doing.
know, I
I'm going to
know.
ask you a question. Do you know who Isser Denilovich is?
I'm sure I'm about to.
Yes, that's the name. That is the original name of the legendary Kirk Douglas.
Yeah, that's exactly where
So they
where I
all
was
did
going
that.
with
They
that.
were all doing that at the
It's
time
like, what
because
A-lister is this about to be their birth name? No, I know they all did it, but I just feel that it's worth mentioning because it's this moment in history that's kind of important to acknowledge, because this is an incredibly prominent Jewish man in American history. And just, it's fascinating to look back on and realize that that was something that was compelled at the time. And an entire episode could be done on that. It's just a moment that I want to flag because it feels significant to me. Um, yeah,
Joe Simon was a Jewish man too.
yeah. I mean,
So
yeah. I I'm glad we confirmed this, but I had a suspicion.
hey, listen, it's kind of funny when you and I, as the big comic book fans that we are, and we actually take a look at all of the biggest names in comic books. It is amazing how so many. I mean, I still didn't even know until very recently that Chris Claremont was Jewish as well. His
Yeah,
mom he is Jewish by his mother's side, which technically means in the religious Jewish community he is fully Jewish. And it makes so much sense considering the characters that he created.
it's funny when you were when you initially mentioned in passing, his Jewish, coming from Jewish family and all of that, as other creators, I actually thought of Chris Claremont immediately because of certain things that have happened in recent history with us. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that, and obviously probably plays a significant role in some of the content that Jack Kirby would go on to create. I don't want to get ahead of myself now, but this is the moment where I wanted to point that out.
Exactly. So he gets together with Joe Simon, who is not that much older than him, but had been in the industry for a little bit longer than him. And they pretty much wanted to get on the superhero train and they wanted to really start going into the worlds that DC had already ventured into. I mean, of course, along with the Holy Trinity around that same time, we would also get people like Will Eisner on the scene, and we would also get Gardner Fox on the scene, who would create some of the characters that would eventually join the JSA. But Joe Simon and Jack Kirby wanted to do something very different, and it turned out that the most opportune thing came at the most opportune time, because you got a, a young Jack Kirby walking to work at Timely Comics, and just a few blocks from him, we're getting into the early years of World War II. At Madison Square Garden, there is an American Nazi Party rally just a couple of blocks from his office. and he knows that it's going on, and he knows from his upbringing that it's like the most evil thing. And he says, "Oh my goodness, what could possibly be a force that could bring these guys down?" And lo and behold, he comes up with that idea. He says, "I want to make a superhero that is against everything that these guys are. A comic book with a character in red, white, and blue punching Hitler in the face, comes onto the scene, and it's Captain America, created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon." And there you go. Their very first truly memorable creation, the one that was one of Jack Kirby's own creations, officially comes to a company called Timely Comics. And just in case you guys haven't figured it out yet, that company will eventually become Marvel Comics.
Yeah. And I mean, it's this is where we get to like where it becomes obvious that Jack Kirby is a comics Mount Rushmore candidate, right? I mean, how much more iconic can you get than the creation of Captain America, one of the most beloved heroes, and that image that will live not just in comics history, but American history of
Yes.
him punching Hitler in the face, and what that did to show that it was a different kind of comic and tie it to the current day that it was
Mhm.
released, to say that it had something to say and was going to be, what Marvel, being the world outside our window, as it's going to end up being as Timely grows and focuses on actual New York as the setting, like it plants the flag, no pun intended, in the real world. And it was really special. And here's also a good part as his career like this starts to grow, where while this episode is not purely the gushing, we have to do it at some point. It also looks unlike anything else. Because
Mhm.
you and I talk on this channel a lot about great art that feels, we use the word cinematic a lot, right? But it's kind of longhand for something that I think is important to note, which is action, motion. And Jack Kirby just had this kinetic kind of style that a still frame just had all the energy of a moving picture, and it just grips you, and it still does. And there's a reason that everybody loves this artwork, and it's not just because he's the first, and it's not just because of the generation of these characters. It's that those stories hold up because when you look at them, there's something very, very lively about all of it, that will be a touchstone to current writers and writers for artists forever. It just will be. There
And you're
was
absolutely
nothing
right.
like it.
Yes, you're absolutely right, because when you take a look at modern comics, you see these gorgeous pieces of art. And it's so funny that when people think back at Jack Kirby's art, and we're talking about some of the greatest names in all of comics, and they even say it's like, when I originally saw Jack Kirby's art, it really wasn't like the greatest thing I ever saw. Like, it was very blocky, it had a lot of shadows. But when they go back to these books and they take a look a little bit deeper, and they take a look at the designs, and they take a look at the shadings, it's like he knew anatomy, and at the same time he knew how to make everything that was still frame feel like it was moving,
Exactly.
and that
Exactly.
every piece of action that was put on the page made you feel that action. Like when you saw the punch on the page, you feel the guy's pain who's actually getting punched, or you feel the force of that fist heading to that enemy's face.
And I think you hear it.
Yeah,
That's
and
another
you
th- when I think of the cover of Captain America 1 punching Hitler, I think, there's no onomatopoeia blurb on it, but you think the thock. You think the ping of the bullet going off of the shield. You feel it because it's kinetic. You're right. And to talk about an artist who comes up on this channel and every conversation about comics for obvious reasons, Jack Kirby is not Alex Ross,
no,
right? And we're not talking about it as if he is. And, is art has its value for very different reasons. It's not always pure technical skill, though there is deep technical skill. in what Jack Kirby does, but he's not the Renaissance era painter of comics, right? Um, Nor is he the impressionist, but damn if he's not the pop artist, right? That makes this like blockbuster flick feeling that let comics be unleashed to be what comics could be to an audience that started to take it for this is more than the funnies. Right? This is cool is what this is. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, again, I also think these days when it comes, I mean, like everybody admires his art, but I think it's more than just his art. I just think that when you really think about Jack Kirby and you really want to talk about what is it that truly inspires you, or what is the thing that he's most you feel most admirable towards him, it's just the things he created, the worlds, the characters, and the fact that he gave these characters personalities and he gave them life and he gave them excellent stories. It like I said, this man's mind never stopped working. This man's hand never stopped moving. He was always ready to create the next big thing. And again, I think he deserves more credit as a overall creator
Hmm.
than
Hmm.
just as an artist. But don't get me wrong. I mean, we're living in a world right now when you will read a comic book and all of a sudden you'll say, oh my God, that artist just made the Kirby Crackle. Do you see it? I mean,
Hmm.
that's one of his biggest claims to fame. The deep explosion with the dark black spots and the yellow and white lines. And you see it in so many comics. You see the inspiration in Marv Wolfman and George Perez's Crisis on Infinite Earths. You see the action sequences in Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird's Ninja Turtles. You see and you recognize and you know that when you're reading another person's work, you're saying to yourself, these guys are Jack Kirby fans. And
This is
that's
the
what makes
legacy.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's what also makes them special because that, as two people who can say we met Kevin Eastman, who is definitely one of the nicest guys, he wanted to be the next Jack Kirby. Because again, he drew these imaginative things, Jack Kirby buildings, Jack Kirby cars, because a Jack Kirby building is not a lifelike building. A Jack Kirby car is not a lifelike car. It's an over imaginative exaggeration of a building or a car or a person. And that's what fuels the imagination of any young creator or just any plain overall reader.
Yeah, and just, while I'm taking my moment that I have it to gush, like not to get too philosophical about it, but I mean, in my mind, that's what art is. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big life imitates art kind of person. I think there's something realer than real to the way that Jack Kirby approaches creativity because it's a version of reality that embeds the meaning behind the image into the image itself, making it grander than the image itself, making it more than photorealism, making it that every element of the art is constructed in service of the kinetic feeling. And I keep going back to that word kinetic because it was so important to what set him apart. But that feeling of the humanity in the stories, which is something that was so special to early Marvel and it really turned heads. And that, as we will inevitably talk about the Fantastic Four very soon, was completely, completely fresh. Um,
Exactly.
yeah.
So we get into World War II. Jack Kirby and Joe Simon go off to war. Thankfully, they survive. And then through the 40s and 50s, the two of them do a bunch of breakthrough things in a world of comics where the superhero is pretty much dead. Nobody's really interested in the superhero because the war is over. People are looking for other interesting things. And it's very interesting to know what innovative things Jack Kirby and Joe Simon did. Like, I did not know that they pretty much gave birth to the romance comic. I didn't know that. or the fact that they gave new life to the Western comic, and how they even were just bouncing around all of these smaller companies, how they did some work for Archie, they did some work for Harvey, the fact that they made all of these little things that would eventually become big parts of DC and Marvel lore. Like, I didn't know that Jack Kirby and Joe Simon created the Challengers of the Unknown. I just read a recent miniseries by Christopher Canwell, and it was very entertaining, very cosmic and imaginative, like Jack Kirby. I didn't know that they basically went and revamped Wesley Dodds, the Golden Age Sandman. It's amazing to know what they did in this time frame, and I also just have to say thank you for the gods that giving us guys like Jack Kirby, because we get to 1954 and we get the infamous Dr. Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, which almost kills the comic book industry. But oh God, thankfully, Jack Kirby did not want to give up what he loved. The fact that even though he and the industry was backed against the wall when the comic book industry was in serious trouble because of that book, you know, and just in case you people out there don't know what this book is, this was written by a psychologist who basically said that the comic books were the devil, basically warping the minds of innocent boys and girls to the point where people were burning comic books in the streets, saying that comic books are not good. I mean, I'm not going to say that they weren't entirely wrong, because this was also a time when comic book creators were basically able to do whatever they wanted. So yes, there were some very violent books, there were some very gruesome horror comics at the time, and there were no age restrictions. So yes, young kids were picking up comic books of monsters eating people, or, you know, people shooting people in the face. So to a certain degree, it's not entirely a surprise that what happened in comics history, but thankfully, comic books would survive.
Yeah. And it's not, look, it's a tale as old as time, right? You know, we're always going to have our next one of these moral panic scapegoats of, you know, the ills of society are actually caused by some innocent art that our kids have access to, that we will blame the creation of instead of, you know, monitoring it ourselves. Tale as old as time. I'm sure anybody watching this video has their version of it, be it comics, be it D&D, be it video games. Like, it just time and time again, the pinnacle of nerd culture at the time is always villainized as being the actual cause of whatever ill society nonsensically. Um, and so we can talk about this for what it is, stupid. But thankfully, thankfully, Jack Kirby persevered through it, and the comic industry as a whole found a way to adapt to it. And now I can look back at the Comics Code Authority as something funny. As
But then, you know, we get now into the late 50s and into the early 1960s, and Jack Kirby goes back to Timely Comics, which apparently was still alive, and it was now under new management by a man named Stan Lee, who actually did work at Timely around the time that Jack Kirby was getting into the business and doing Captain America comics with Joe Simon. So clearly there was value that Stan saw in Jack, and he knew that Jack had a talent for creation, and he had such an imagination. And, you know, we're getting into the point where the space race is now the big thing, science fiction is in, DC is about to release their Silver Age, but Stan Lee wants to beat DC at their game, and he says to Jack, let's create a world. And thus, Timely Comics becomes Marvel Comics, and in 1961, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee get the ball rolling with Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four.
And it makes this an extra timely moment to be talking about this because of the Fantastic Four movie coming out recently, which I will remind Steve that I still haven't seen.
Darn it.
Though I will correct that.
Dude, just see K-pop Demon Hunters first.
Yeah, fair enough. Um, but yeah, so and the Fantastic Four, Marvel's first family, the to talk about if Jack Kirby's art was so important for Captain America and what that meant for the moment, what these characters in Fantastic Four represent now for the future of comics is equally, if not more important to comics specifically. Because we've talked about it on this channel when talking about the Fantastic Four. These are flawed characters. These are the kind of characters that you didn't see in comics before now. These are the characters who have doubts. These are the characters who are real people. And they're not Greek gods with underwear on the outside, and that's it, right? They have interpersonal relationships, and they might wake up feeling a little sadder than they did the day before. And it's this thing that is so radical and so changing to what comics would be that the concept of that being new is mind-blowing in 2025.
And I
And
think,
yet, that is how important Fantastic Four was.
yeah, and I think what's even more amazing is the fact that, Jack didn't forget where he came from. And he said, there were some other supernatural heroes and superhero creations that were still like just lying around that we haven't really done anything with. So let's bring the Human Torch back, but not the same Human Torch. Let's make him a young kid as part of the Fantastic Four. I mean, eventually the original Human Torch would come back to Marvel Comics in one shape or form. I'm actually reading and have read some recent Marvel comics that did have the original Human Torch. Let's bring the Submariner back and put him in the Fantastic Four comics. And so they even start taking some of the older creations that had been done. But of course, the Fantastic Four comes out, and one of the most amazing things about Jack Kirby is the fact that a guy that had also created horror comics at one point in time was able to take actual monsters, especially with the way they look, one being the Thing, and still managing to turn him into an iconic superhero with a heart of gold. A lot of people love this stuff, but some people have to remember, believe it or not, everybody, Jack Kirby did not create Spider-Man. That was Steve Ditko and Stan Lee. But there were not just other heroes lying around. There were also all of these comic books that Time Lee had been creating. There was Journey into Mystery. There was Tales of Suspense, Tales to Astonish. All of these books that had other creations and other stories in there, they took each and every one of these and threw in a Jack Kirby character that would eventually become just as iconic as the Fantastic Four and just continue to expand the Marvel Universe. Tales to Astonish, we were introduced to a character named Ant-Man. Journey into Mystery, we were introduced to a character called Thor. Tales of Suspense, we were introduced to a character called Iron Man. We would also, just a few months earlier, be introduced to another brand new hero in his own comic, but more of a monster than a hero. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee gave us the Incredible Hulk, a man who turns into a gigantic monster and just wreaks havoc and can't control himself. And yet they make this character a character that everybody wants to read about, wants to appreciate, wants to even love. And in 1963, we see the very first true Marvel Universe comic when the Avengers come together to fight and stop the Hulk. And even at the same time, another book is created. They make the X-Men. And they also decide, hey, Jack, you're on such a roll. Avengers issue number 4 is coming out. Let's bring Captain America out of there. Like, where's he been? Like, let's put him in the Avengers comics. They were just like pumping all of these books out. And again, that's another thing that has been lost in comics. You take, and I always get frustrated when I see my pull list and I'm like, oh, this book has been delayed. Jack Kirby did not let that happen. This man,
Nope.
you needed him to get 5 panels done in a nick of time. He'd get it done earlier than a nick of time because he knew how much these books meant to him and these characters meant to him. He was not going to stop.
Definitely, definitely. And is this I want to follow your timeline here, Steve. At some point, I want to talk about Stan Lee a little bit,
We will.
which
We were literally gonna.
where I was gonna say we seem to be cresting there with their powers combined. But I'll hold off for just one more moment to be like, but you see, in that pedigree, think of the heroes that we just named right there, that we had to carve out Spider-Man, but all of the other big ticket Marvel characters who are living in pop culture today, who are the big box office names, who are the ones that are gone back to time and time again whenever there's a relaunch in comics, whether it's the Ultimate Universe initiative for people who are following us on our Ultimate Journey, or the new Ultimate Comics initiative for people who have been reading comics for the last year and a half, 2 years. Um, these characters, as anyone watching this channel knows, are the characters in comics that we go back to time and time again, that every creator wants to come to. One of them, they might not have dreams to write all of them, but think about the legacy that these characters have left on what comics have become. These are all household names at this point, whether you've picked up a comic or not, and that's incredible.
Yeah, and this is also when he's not just cranking out characters, but he's also building outlandish worlds. I mean, he creates the world of Black Panther and Wakanda. The first black superhero, and he creates a world where there's this hidden city in Africa that has technology beyond human capacity at the time. He starts to build this vast cosmic universe through the world of Fantastic Four with the quintessential Marvel story, the coming of Galactus, and introducing the Silver Surfer and Galactus and the Watcher, showing that we can go further than what's just here on Earth. Jack Kirby may be doing all of this stuff, but he's not really a face that is put in front of the public to sell these books. And that's why Stan Lee is there. Jack Kirby wrote and drew, or more, Jack Kirby drew. Stan Lee wrote good stories alongside Jack Kirby, but the most important thing was this was also when Stan Lee just changed his whole image, the slick comb over, the thick sunglasses, howdy true believers. None of these books would have sold if it wasn't for Stan Lee. Stan Lee was the face. Stan Lee sold Jack Kirby's work.
Yeah, and let's, I want to make sure that I give Stan Lee the credit that is due, because in writing these characters, not just the story, but the characters, writing them, he he breathed a life into them, right? And the characters that we know and love of Jack Kirby's creation that have endured and will endure forever, they were given their soul by by Stan Lee. So this is by no means to diminish what he brought to the table. Um, I think really the best way to kind of frame it is these heroes and comics today as we know it wouldn't exist without either of them. It just couldn't have happened
Mm-hmm.
missing either of them. We would never would be where we are right now.
Yes.
Some of the friction and the bitterness, you know, you can choose to lay it at Stan Lee's feet. I think that would be largely unfair. But comics were so new in this scope, and Jack Kirby as a creator holding the pen like that was such a new concept that the idea of the artist not getting the same credit as the writer was not solely a Stan Lee problem or creation, right?
Yes.
And it's a shameful growing pain of the medium, especially in that a founding father of modern comics ends up in his lifetime not getting to enjoy the full fruits of his labor that is deserved from the legacy that lives from his work and what he contributed to it. I think one of the most beautiful things about Jack Kirby's legacy, that were he here today to be able to see, would be the way artists are treated being so different now. That he
Exactly.
that he endured something so that others don't have to, quite frankly. And I think there's a lot of honor in that, even if there isn't a lot of personal satisfaction to be found.
No, and I mean, it's like, at this point in time, we're getting through the 60s and we're really seeing the world of the superheroes on all corners just busting through. But, the fact that Jack Kirby never got any opportunities to move up in Marvel, like, he could have been like the chairman of the board. He could have been like the number one to Stan Lee in management. He could have easily been given more money, but the fact that you know Stan Lee and management said, "Oh, it's a corporate thing. We can't do that." I'm not going to say that if it was a blatant lie or if it was a half truth because I wasn't there, but you're absolutely right with what you said. I mean, look, seeing and learning about Jack Kirby getting treated like this, this wasn't the last time that something like this happened. But unfortunately, the world was a little bit different at that time where people could actually do something about it. And what I'm getting at is Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Mark
Yeah,
Silvestri, these guys were doing all this work in the late 80s, early 90s, and not getting the true credit that they deserved. They were in a different time and had the ability to give the finger to the corporate comic world and say, we're going to start our own company and we're going to do everything for the creators that you are not. Jack Kirby thankfully lived to see that day happen.
yeah,
That's one of the other things that people are so grateful for. The fact that Jack Kirby got to see things that he hoped for in his time
yeah,
come to pass. And
yeah.
I'm glad that he did.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it goes back to, inherently, Jack Kirby was not a businessman, right? Like everything we're talking about is the creativity of his soul and what he brought to the table in that sense, right? And I mean, it is it is a sad thing that there is a history of creatives being taken advantage of by the people who are able to profit off of their creations, right? It's beautiful that his creations were able to be disseminated to a wide audience. And it's wonderful that after a talent like him opened so many doors, things could change for artists that came after him. So again, whether there's half truths or outright lies, you can envision a different way of treating Jack Kirby because artists have been treated in different, more positive ways since then.
Yes.
He is held back both by the conventions and the glacial pace of change at the time. But again, that's if we measure his value less in the money he was paid for and more on the impact that he's had, there's no one who compares.
Because you see, even though these things were happening, but of course, he never demanded these things because he was greedy. I mean, I still think it's absolutely disgusting that Marvel wouldn't even let him keep any of his original drawings of any of these characters. I mean, that's just very below the belt. But bless his heart, he still cared for the fans. He would be living in a nice area of Long Island at this point in time, and he would actually let local kids and fans of his actually come to his house and exchange stories. And I mean, we'll get a little bit further into that because there's a very important thing to discuss at the very end of Jack Kirby's life. But the fact that some of those kids that did get those opportunities were kids that would eventually come into the comic book industry themselves. He left Marvel because he needed to feed his family. You need to find better pastures. And unfortunately, he didn't really get what he was looking for. He would reluctantly go to DC. He really wouldn't get the kind of money that he wanted. And the reason why was because they looked at him as this older guy, and he was not making the kind of money that some of the newcomers were making in the 1970s. But that didn't stop him from making more breakthroughs, because for his short-lived time at DC from 1970 to 1975, Jack Kirby would create his iconic Fourth World. We'd be introduced to the battles of New Genesis and Apocalypse, and we'd be introduced to the Forever People, and we'd be introduced to all of these cosmic characters that would eventually be roped into DC's lore. And we're talking about Darkseid, Big Barda, Granny Goodness, Mr. Miracle, all of these iconic cosmic beings, especially if you're a Superman fan. If you do not read comic books, but you have watched Superman the animated series, you know and you love these characters. Yeah, Orion, the female Furies, Light Ray, all of these incredible creations that we had never seen before. I mean, he took his love for the beyond that he started to create at Marvel and just took it to the next level with these Fourth World / New God characters.
And again, like we're saying, still that lack of ownership, that lack of recognition, that shameful truth of that lingers in the move to DC, not offering him what he himself wanted to find in that move. But for fans and for the legacy, as you're talking about with all these characters that people will know, whether from the comics themselves or from to this day, how they get reused in the idea of Darkseid, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like a contribution later on in the canon of these characters that then become that integral, which is insane to comprehend, right?
Oh yeah.
But it's because he's the kind of creator, and it's like you were talking about earlier, Steve, about the idea that he always needed a pen in his hand. He was always creating. It was to a real artist like Jack Kirby, it's a faucet that you can't really turn off. It's just he's a conduit to the to the creation. And as much as the recognition and the monetary reward was shamefully held from him at the time, the creations that he birthed are just so wonderful and so meaningful, and that legacy that he has from it is
Yeah.
what we're going to talk about forever.
Yeah. And so, of course, unfortunately, he would end up leaving DC because he was still feeling like he got the raw end of the stick. By this
And he
time,
did.
yeah, at this point in time, he had moved out with his family to California, and that was basically where he would be for the rest of his life. He would unwillingly go back to Marvel, practically kicking and screaming. But again, what really upsets me is that, he comes back to the guy who he felt did him wrong. The fact that Stan Lee still wanted him to come back, not because of the fact that he wanted to sort of visit with an old friend, but he's like, oh great, we can get some more ideas from him and we can make more money. And Jack Kirby didn't get what he deserved when he even came back to Marvel for a second time after all he created. But he still comes back and expands their cosmic universe with the Eternals. I had no idea he is the creator of Devil Dinosaur that would eventually become Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur in the 2010s. But I'm just like, we're now living in a world where we have the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And until the day he died, Stan Lee was in every single one of these movies. And like everybody thinks that Stan Lee is God's gift to the world. I learn more about Jack Kirby, the more I hate this man. And it and I hate the fact that I say that stuff. But at the same time, I take a look at my monthly pull list, and I'm so happy with how little Marvel comics I'm reading right now. I'm sorry, because the story needs to be told.
Yeah.
I will never, ever take away from Stan Lee what he gave to comics. I will never take away his presence, his gravitas. But the fact that there are so many people in this world that if they had the ability to see him again, they would punch him in the face. And we're talking Jack Kirby, we're talking Todd McFarlane. These guys, they hate him. They hated or hate him because of the way he treated them. And it's sad that this is a truly gifted person who gave pop culture something wonderful, but he did it shamelessly at the expense of others.
Yeah, and it's a complicated legacy.
Exactly.
And we've touched on it already to a certain extent. So what I will leave it with at this is I really do believe that we would not have these characters as we know them. We would not have comics as we know them without both Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. People are real people, and it's everyone is not the story being told. Um, and with creative types even more frequently than most, there can be a little bit of darkness there. There can be that kind of complicated, other side of the coin. So I don't think either of us are taking away from the contribution of Stan Lee when we say complicated, did not get along with people, and did some hurtful things to others who were also creatives. Doesn't change his legacy either, and his impact on comics.
What I think is really funny is that so many creators on Marvel and DC side, like they always talk about like the gods of those worlds. I believe the one in DC is called the One Above All. I keep forgetting what is like the absolute god of the Marvel universe. And apparently, a couple of times when they've actually shown both of these characters' faces, it's usually Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
And rightfully it should be. And it's also really funny because when I take a look at myself and I take a look at the MCU movies, it's ironic which ones I love the most. And it's Captain America and the Winter Soldier, followed by the Fantastic Four at this point in time. And believe it or not, one of my absolute favorites, which is grossly underappreciated, is Eternals. And I'm like, they're all Jack Kirby's. That makes so much sense because they're unlike the typical superhero. There's so much whimsy and there's so much cosmic storytelling in these films. And I'm like, I think that's why I like them so much, because they're so different and they're so Jack Kirby.
Yeah.
And that's what I love the most about them.
Yeah. Yeah. In their diversity of what they bring to the table, they show that same through line of what he meant to comics.
Exactly. And so, of course, he officially just throws his hands up and he says in the late 70s, he's done with these guys. He's out of the comic book industry. And eventually he goes on to animation again. And he actually ends up doing work for Ruby Spears, which I actually know the name of that company well. They did do a lot of work with Hanna-Barbera. And again, something I did not know, that he is the one who designed Thundar the Barbarian and one of the best cartoons from the early 80s. And now that I think about it, the Centurions, and you take a look at the way these characters are designed and how epic that cartoon is, I'm like, oh my God, that is so Jack Kirby.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is. It's
It is.
unbelievable when you think about that.
Yeah, and I didn't know that, and that's now I'm thinking about that. It's like, yeah, that's very Jack Kirby.
And it's just upsetting that he never got the accolades that he deserved, to the point that when he actually died in 1994, he pretty much was working until the day he died. And,
Hmm.
you know, I'm one of those people, I never really thought about it until got to the point where I got married and had to start worrying more about my adult responsibilities than my, childhood responsibilities. But my old boss once told me, you don't want to get buried with your work. You don't want to die at your desk. But you want to know something? I don't think Jack Kirby would have been the type of guy that would have just enjoyed retirement. Like even if he lived 20 more years and died at 91 instead of 71, he was not the kind of guy that was going to wake up one morning and say, I'm going to go fishing or I'm going to go play pickleball with my buddies. No, this was the kind of guy that wanted to just get up, go down to his desk, and create something, because
Yeah.
that's what he loved to do the most. But one of the few things that we need to do, this is going to be our last part of this creators notes episode, and this is going to probably be the only time we ever do this. With every strong man, there is a very strong woman, and Jack Kirby would never have been the legacy that he was if it wasn't for his wife Roz. She was his lifeblood. She was the one that watched him, cared for him, put up with him through any means necessary, and let him be who he was, because she knew that this was what made him happy. And it wasn't just the fact that she looked out for him and their children, she also appreciated his fans. I think in the documentary that I recommended to you, I
Which I
think
did watch, by the way,
which I
which was great.
what I think my favorite part of that documentary is when they're interviewing Len Wein and Marv Wolfman together, and they're like, we used to come over for milk and cookies on Saturdays. And then Marv Wolfman said, and we would get there, and his wife Roz would force us to have something to eat.
Yeah.
And Len would follow up saying, yes, because it was a Jewish house, and you couldn't go into a Jewish house without having a sandwich. So he said, yes, we'd have a sandwich first, and then we'd go down and hang out with Jack. I mean, the fact that she would let Jack Kirby, their home, be an open house for young fans and young creators to just hear stories, watch him draw, ask for advice. The fact that she would take care of them just as well and just as beautifully as she did her own family.
Hmm.
That's why Jack Kirby is who he is. He wouldn't have been who he was if it wasn't for his wife Roz. And
Yeah.
I'm so glad of that. And I'm so glad that she was so passionate about his work as he was.
Yeah, and my broken record word tonight has been legacy with good reason, right? And when you think of the way that she supported him and also helped grow that community around him that would go on to become creators themselves, you realize if the legacy of Jack Kirby is what's so important, then it's that genealogy of people who were inspired by him that is that legacy. And it leaves you wondering, of course, the work speaks for itself. Could the work have existed without her? Probably not. And would some of those people who were key creators, who would go on to really be the torchbearers after him, would they have been able to find the same thing within themselves without that connection they were able to build based on the safety that she created in that experience, being able to share in moments in their home, in more personal feedback? No. And so when we talk about the importance of his legacy, that legacy was molded by her.
Yeah. And take a look at those two guys that I just mentioned, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman.
Yeah.
Two guys that got advice and got to spend time with Jack Kirby. And look at what they went on to do. Len Wein would take a defunct Jack Kirby creation in the X-Men with Roy Thomas, bring it to life again in 1975 with giant size X-Men, only to have a young guy come to Marvel named Chris Claremont and say, I want to take these characters that these guys made and I want to do my tabula rasa and look at what the X-Men became.
Yeah.
Marv Wolfman would team up with George Perez. They would create the Teen Titans. They would create one of the most iconic creations in DC history, one of the greatest stories in DC history that would shape comic book storytelling from 1985 and forward in Crisis on Infinite Earths, creating the word, the infamous DC word crisis, and create a future in comic writing there. The fact that these guys did this is simply because of the fact that they knew a man named Jack Kirby, and this man showed me how to write comics. Not me per se, but them.
And we said it in this very episode that Crisis on Infinite Earths, that feels a whole lot like
That is
like a
very
Kirby
Kirby.
book. It just does. It just does. And it's we've got nothing but clear examples of things inspired by, why they were inspired by, what the connection was, how the legacy continues. And it's just you can't pick up a cosmic story. You can't pick up a human story, and you certainly can't pick up any Marvel story
No.
without crediting it in some way, shape, or form.
Not just that, it's DC too. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the other people who praises Jack Kirby is Mark Waid.
Hmm.
Think about the stories that Mark Waid got to write, from
Yeah.
his iconic Flash run to Kingdom Come
Hmm.
with Alex
Alex Ross,
Ross.
also mentioned in this episode for very different reasons.
Yeah.
The reason that we're able to do this, the reason that we're able to just rattle off favorite stories, greatest comics, known creators, artists who changed the game, it's all in the context of what they owe to Jack Kirby. So
Mhm.
whether we successfully pull off doing the laundry list of absolutely every creator we've ever loved and discussed on this
Yeah.
channel or not, it doesn't change the
Yeah.
fact that something is owed back to him in some way, shape, or
Absolutely.
form.
I mean, another giant who we just lost a few months ago, Jim Shooter.
Yeah.
The one of the greatest editors in chiefs that Marvel Comics ever had. He even said it in a Chris Claremont documentary. He said, I read a lot of comic books and I wanted to understand why the Marvel comics were better.
Hmm.
Well, there's a very good reason why the comic books in Marvel at the time were
We're
better.
better.
And it was because Jack Kirby created all of these unbelievable creations. But, you know, the fact that Roz understood who he was, I think it's amazing that his kids said that, he would wake up and Roz would have picked out his clothes for him. If he found money in his pocket, it was because Roz put it there. The fact that he couldn't even drive a car because he was never able to focus on the road because he was focusing on his next big story or his next panel that he had to get in for work. But the other thing is, she was deeply caring of him because they even said that when they actually finally had the comic book conventions and Roz would be there with Jack, if fans would not just talk to Jack, they talked to her.
Yeah.
And the minute a name that was venomous coming across her brain, they said she'd bare her fangs and she would be vicious towards those people. And she would protect him in his older
Hmm.
years when he would literally draw something and just hand it over to a kid in a convention. She would stop him and say, why you have that? And he said, well, Jack gave it to me. And she's like, no, sweetie, he didn't. The fact that she really watched out for him. But I think what melted my heart learning about her and how important she was to him and how important he was to her was the fact that she didn't know what was going to happen to her when Jack passed. And the fact that she would still go to comic book conventions as an honorary guest
Hmm.
after he was gone, not knowing anything about the comics like Jack Kirby, but would still be invited into a room filled with people and get a standing ovation
Hmm.
because they looked at this woman saying that you are the reason why Jack Kirby was given to us and he was able to do what he did, and it was all thanks to her for just being the support that she was as his loving wife. And she was his one and only. That's something that we don't see in popular culture anymore. It's not.
Yeah.
Now it's about TikTok and body counts and stuff like that. I can't believe I'm even getting into this
Oh
topic
man,
about
Steve,
Jack
you
Kirby.
sound ancient, my guy.
Yeah, but I'm just like the fact that he married his one true love
Yeah,
and they stuck together. If that doesn't inspire you to be a better person, I don't know what else does.
exactly. And I mean, the warmth is wonderful. So, I mean, despite, Steve's insistence upon the TikToks, the penny whistles, and moon pies, I do think there is something genuinely beautiful there. So I don't mean to make too light of it because it is wonderful, that they had each other and that she supported him through all of these things and really was the reason why we're able to sit here talking about what he gave us to the world because she gave him to us.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's a beautiful thing.
I mean, I still think that we'll leave it with this last thought. Again, he was fortunate enough to see a lot of things that he really thought that comics should be come to pass.
Yeah.
One of the things that he said that people thought would never happen until hell froze over was he said, one day comic art is going to be looked at as more than just scribbles on a page, and you're going to see comic books in museums.
Hmm.
And guess what? We do now.
He got to see that too. So,
Mhm.
and he was ahead of the curve on that.
Absolutely.
Because who would have thought the going back to the very beginning of this, the funnies in the newspaper, right? It's not on that level. And now here we are in 2025, the impact that he had on pop culture, the power that comics have over our society is
Exactly.
is immense. It's unimaginable what happened between doodling on those tenement walls
Yeah.
and where we are now. It's a different world. It's
Yeah.
crazy.
And the best part about him, and this will be my last thought, is the fact that you don't even need to read anything that Jack Kirby wrote because you can just pick up any Marvel comic, any DC comic, any indie comic, even, and just find little specks of Jack Kirby in any comic book
Yeah.
today. And that's what makes him the true greatest. He to me, he is the goat of
Hmm.
comic books. People can fight me on that, but I truthfully believe that he is the greatest that comics has ever had, and there never will be
No,
another like him. There
no,
never will
there
be.
can't be. There just can't be because he has changed the world of comics. And so he did that. So there will never be another Jack Kirby, and there need not be another Jack Kirby because he did it. But truly a titan of comics.
Absolutely. Yes. So I think that's going to wrap up a wonderful episode of Creators Notes, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you took something away from this because we, as comic book readers, vast comic book readers, we not just love reading our comics, but we really love investing and discussing comic book history because the line goes, we don't know where we're going until we know where we've been. And Please leave a comment. Please leave a like. Let us know your thoughts on Jack Kirby. Are there certain creations of his that inspire you? Are there creators that inspire you that were inspired by Jack Kirby? Have you read the book that I showed at the beginning of this video? Because it is a fantastic book. Andy, I would highly recommend you read it as well, because it is a beautiful piece of
Yeah.
work. And we would love to talk to you about it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you're up to date with all of our latest videos. And we will see you all in the next one.